You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. And today we have a topic we've never discussed in the last 8 years, and I don't know why it's taken so long to talk about incentives and economic development, meaning that why do companies, entrepreneurs make decisions to locate or stay in a city, county, state, or a region, and what incentivizes them to do that? And we basically have an expert on that subject, Ellen Harpel, who is the founder of Smart Incentives and appearing first time on BioTalk. So Ellen, welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich. So delighted to be here.
Yeah, great to be with you. We've done a little bit of work with you over the last 10 or 15 years, but it's fine maybe to let everybody know exactly about your organization and what you do. But first of all, why don't we have you introduce yourself to the listeners, because you can do that better than I can.
Sure. So Ellen Harpel, my company is Smart Incentives. I've been an economic development consultant for almost all of my career, which is quite a number of years by this time. I started out with a site selection consulting firm and moved out on my own around 1999. So I've been doing this for a very long time. In addition to my work with Smart Incentives, I continue to do other non-incentive economic development work, and I am an affiliate faculty member at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, and I have several partners that I work with there on issues of regional economic development. To talk a little bit about Smart Incentives, I want to lead off with our mission because I've been really excited about it. It's been the heart of my work for the past several years. The purpose of Smart Incentives, our mission, is to make economic development and business incentives work better for the local, state, or national governments that offer them. And by working better, we mean making sure that the incentive programs are effective. That means they do what they're supposed to do. And that they're responsible. That means that the benefits are in line with the costs. And we do this by providing easy access to resources and guidance to help leaders make the best decisions for their communities. And like I said, I've been an economic development consultant for many years, and I saw that incentives were just a pain point for so many organizations. They usually are, in point of fact, a small part of economic development work, but they get a lot of attention. And a lot of organizations really struggle with program management and providing quality reporting to figure out if their incentives are actually accomplishing their objectives. And these are common challenges across the country, but each organization was basically trying to figure out solutions on their own. So Smart Incentives is a platform for sharing, we hope, clear, practical information to help economic development professionals and policymakers make good decisions about their incentive programs. I hope that we are a trusted resource. We definitely have some unique expertise in this field, and we really want to make relevant resources widely accessible to decision makers so that they can make sure that their incentive policies are doing what you said, Rich, that they're leading to positive economic development, they're helping businesses make good decisions that benefit the state or the community that are offering the incentives.
Thank you for that intro. One thing you didn't mention is where you're located, and do you just work locally or do you do things on a national basis, Ellen?
I'm in Arlington, Virginia, so I'm near you across the river, but my practice is national and occasionally international. This is an issue around not just the country, but the world. You had one more question that was part of that.
Yeah, you answered it. And one of the things I didn't know is that you're part of the George Mason faculty. And I was just at George Mason's Manassas campus last Thursday because they had a big announcement, which was their new 6,000-acre designated research park, or innovation park, actually, called Nexus 234. And Amy Adams with George Mason, who runs the Institute for BioHealth Innovation, which is a nice name. For those who don't know a lot about economic development in general, especially when you look at policies associated with economic development, which vary dramatically at the local, state, or at the national level, Talk a little bit about why state and local governments utilize economic development incentives in the first place, and why were they created?
It's an important question. It's valuable when we're talking about incentives to go back to those reasons. At heart, it really comes down to the fact that people love their communities. Some economists talk about activity as if place doesn't matter, but place matters a lot to people. People love their communities. They want them to prosper. They want the people in them to prosper. This usually includes, it's not limited to, but it includes having good jobs and encouraging investment in the places where they live and work. But the business investment decisions and economic well-being of individual places are almost entirely driven by forces that they don't control. States and communities can't control global economic trends. They can't control business cycles, technology developments, interest rates. It goes on and on. The things that drive economic well-being aren't in their control. One thing that they can control are incentives that can be offered to encourage the kind of activity that they hope to see in their community. And in a place like the US, where we have, and this is obviously a great thing, we have free movement of labor and capital. So both people and money have a lot of choice about where to go and when they go. We live in a country where the business culture, the taxes, and the regulations do vary quite a bit by state. Think of just how different Maryland, DC, and Virginia are from each other in our own area. It behooves a business to look at each one and say, which one is best for me? This kind of competition, this movement is always happening, and that's a real strength of the U.S. economy. But again, if you're a state or a community, you're trying to figure out how to position yourself to do well in this environment. And then the third factor is that we really, unlike other parts of the world, we really don't have a reliable or coherent economic development policy at the federal level, at the national level. Most states and local governments are really left to fend for themselves on this front. So while they do a lot of different things, they can and do invest in themselves on long-term education, infrastructure, quality of place, things that also affect business investment decisions. But incentives are one of the few levers in their control that has the potential to generate near-term, measurable, and visible benefits for those objectives that they have to make their communities better off. So it's a very sensible, understandable policy choice to make, I think, to use incentives for economic development.
And I think one of the things that listeners need to be aware of is also that a lot of state and local governments' incentives change when you have a change in a governor, a change in a mayor, a change in a county executive. And so basically, they're very fluid and they're flexible based on changing conditions, changing priorities related to different administrations as they come into office. Is that a dynamic that you see happen frequently?
That's absolutely right. They need to change. In fact, I think they probably need to change more than they do because the world changes, the economic environment changes. I spend a lot of time with my clients right now looking at their incentive portfolios that were developed in response to the 2008 economic downturn or conditions in 2018. Conditions right now are very different, but a lot of states still have some legacy programs designed for a very different time. They were designed to accomplish objectives that maybe aren't the primary objective for today. So there needs to be that churn. But you also described the political dynamic, and that is also true. Different governors and mayors have different priorities, and then they adapt as they go. I think that's a good thing. You don't want to have wholesale change for if something is working, you want it to keep working. And I think we'll spend some more time talking about how we know what's working. But it's also a very smart thing to do to regularly review your incentive portfolio to make sure it's still accomplishing what you need it to do given the challenges that you're facing today.
Well, that was a great lead in. You said we're going to talk more about what's working. So really, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, you've been tracking trends on incentives for a couple decades now and probably understand what really makes incentives work and what is it about incentives that don't work sometimes. What's the good and the bad with the incentives and also the dynamic that you have to change when you see that something's not working. So talk a little bit about what's working, what hasn't worked.
So there are three big things I want to talk about now, and happy to dive into any of them more or go further if you like. But the first big one is understanding what it is supposed to achieve. It's amazing how many incentives, especially those that are written into the tax code, don't have a clear policy objective or performance metrics associated with them. So there might be a tax break given to a certain type of business, but it's not clear what anyone hoped to achieve by offering that tax break. So one of the requirements for understanding if an incentive is effective is knowing what it's supposed to be effective at. And so there's been a lot of improvement in making sure that when new programs are created, articulating what they are supposed to do, the strategy that they are supposed to support. So that's number one, making sure that your incentive is doing something that it's supposed to do, not just ending up being a cost buried in the tax code. The second thing is maybe a little bit less intuitive. It's that we have learned that it's not so much what incentives are offered. It's how they're offered, how they're designed and managed that really determines how successful they are, how effective they are at achieving any objective at all. A lot of incentive policy making begins with benchmarking. They say so-and-so has this incentive. They seem to be very successful with it. Let's learn about that incentive, or let's look at our incentive program offerings in relationship to another state. That's fine, but programs that look very similar in name and intent can be structured very differently. And then that affects how well they perform in achieving any outcomes that are of interest. For example, a few years ago, we looked at incentives for entrepreneurial firms. This was very informative for me. And we learned that even something very specific, like an angel investor tax credit, which sounds very narrow, very well defined, they're all over the place across the states. They can have very different eligibility rules and procedures that make the tax credit behave differently from state to state. Even though it's called the same thing, its effectiveness comes from how it's designed and administered. And then the third thing that we've learned is that programs that are actively managed, and this includes tracking performance, it turns out, perform better than those that just sit in the tax code, or they're just a program run in a silo, not connected to anything and kind of on autopilot. If a company has to apply for an incentive, there has to be an incentive agreement that specifies performance criteria, and payments are based on whether those criteria were met. All of these factors lead to better outcomes for the place that's offering the incentives. And to answer your question about what doesn't perform well, by far, the worst performing incentives tend to be provisions that are just sit in the tax code. They aren't actively monitored, let alone managed by anyone, but they end up costing millions of dollars. And it's not clear, because nobody's monitoring them, that they're generating any benefits to the public. Or, and we see this a surprising amount of time too, they might exist in the tax code, but nobody uses them. So they're intended to generate a benefit, but they're barely used. So they're basically, you have to say they're not effective because they're not accomplishing the policy objective.
Thank you for that. But one of the things that I see happen a lot these days is a lot of incentives are tied to job creation because it's economic development. You want to enhance the economy. And with job creation, depending on how well the company performs to meet its expectations of what their projection was before they came into a new locale and promised to create these jobs, what are you seeing related to companies who make big promises but don't miss them? And then you have county councils or state legislatures or other people complaining that, hey, we gave them millions of dollars. They were supposed to create these jobs. They didn't do it. And then what I'm hearing about is clawbacks. How do you recapture incentives that people didn't actually achieve when they said they were going to? So what do you see as the trend there and what's happening?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things happening there. One is that most incentives now, especially newly designed incentives, are structured as pay for performance. Clawback is one thing. You can create incentive programs that have clawbacks where the company has to give the community back money, but that's hard. If a project has failed or a company is struggling already, then to add clawbacks to it is difficult for everyone. And so pay for performance is often a better structure for incentives, and that's how most new incentives are designed. But whatever the situation is, however somebody decides to design their incentive, there needs to be that some mechanism in case the project doesn't work out as planned, because almost certainly it won't work out exactly as planned, not through anyone's evil doings, but things change. You can't plan for every situation. We just wrote about Amazon HQ2. That's a good example of, there was obviously the highest profile project we've seen for a long time and a very big incentive package that Virginia offered. But the most important job creation tax incentives are performance-based. And Virginia wrote it so that the incentives are only paid after the jobs that meet certain quality criteria are retained for 5 years. So there's quite a lag and a lot of responsibility on the company to meet these criteria before they even get any kind of payment whatsoever. So that's a good structure. But a lot of things have happened in the world since 2018. And while Amazon has created 8,500 jobs in Northern Virginia, they had said that they would create 11,000 some jobs. It's up to you how you look at that. Do you say they failed because we only have 8,500 jobs instead of 11,500 jobs or whatever the number was? Or do you say this is still great for the community because we have 8,500 jobs that weren't there, and Virginia is only paying the incentive on the qualified jobs, which isn't all 8,500, but it's 7,000 some number after they've only met these other criteria. So I think that's a very intelligent way to structure an incentive, and only policymakers and the public have to decide how they look at that information and whether that's a good project or a bad project. That's a win, but it's fair to say it did not meet the expectations, but the incentives are structured so that nobody's at financial risk by not meeting those expectations.
People could look at that as somewhat of a failure, but if you look at having Amazon in the BioHealth Capital Region in DC with HQ2 and 8,500 jobs, that's a win in my mind. But beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, as they say. So it really depends on the people who are making those judgments. So
what's nice is that we have enough data to have this conversation. That was also built into the package where all of this is publicly reported. That's a big advancement, and that's the information that we need to have the good quality debate about whether this is good policy, whether it's a worthwhile project, et cetera. So that's a win too.
I think with that one, you've got a public company where probably a lot of that reporting sometimes is required, but there's a lot of private companies that hold that information more secretive than what a public company would be. And I would imagine sometimes that's more difficult to get that information from private companies versus what public companies have to report. Is that true?
I do think that's true. But if a company is receiving public incentives, it makes sense to be clear up front. Here's the reporting requirements that come along with this. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. Then look elsewhere for another program or something else. But if you want to participate in this program, these are the rules of the road. To me, that's very reasonable and very fair. And you can think about exactly what you want to ask and how you want it reported. But I think that just is how it should be.
That's why it should be. Okay. Before we get into some of the major successes or wins in our BioHealth Capital Region, we just talked about Amazon and 11,500 or 8,500 jobs. Most people really think incentives are only for large companies. What kind of incentives are really available for emerging companies, emerging entrepreneurs, startups? Do you see incentives that are being offered to them? Maybe not of the same magnitude, but there are incentive programs for emerging and potentially high growth companies as well?
There absolutely are. Almost every state offers them in some way, shape, or form. It depends a little bit about if you have a very narrow definition of incentive, you might not say, oh, that's exactly how I think of an incentive. But from our point of view, there's really a spectrum of financing programs and services that are intended to alter or reward business behavior. So the most common for small businesses are different types of financial incentives. So it might include loans or loan guarantee programs. Every state has these. The federal government, through the State Small Business Credit Initiative, has given a lot of money to support programs that do that. There are a lot of different kinds of grant programs. They tend not to be big dollar programs because they're grants, but even something like SBIR, that's a grant program, right? And states have other kinds of small grants to help startup firms, often in technology or innovation-related fields. And probably a lot of programs, but not a lot of dollars, or a lot of companies help through that, but they exist. And then equity investments. So this is also a pretty common category, also supported in many states by SSBCI funds, but also many states have been doing this on their own. So this includes venture funds or ways to get venture funding to startup companies in the specific state. Sometimes that's by giving some public money to existing venture funds, and other times it's more direct. For example, I think in Maryland, the TEDCO fund programs would fall into this category. They're, I think, established, and TEDCO's been around for a long time. So that's one of those examples. A second category are these services incentives. So you might think about incubators and accelerator programs supported by economic development groups or public sector money, different types of tech transfer, technology development support activities, maybe supporting early stage researchers or encouraging tech transfer, networking, specialized professional services, especially for researchers or innovation oriented people that don't have the legal or accounting and marketing skills, and to bring those to companies. There are tax incentives for entrepreneurial firms. There are more incentives probably for the investors in those firms, but the incentives for the entrepreneurial firms themselves tend not to be the best structure. So they might exist in some places, but they tend not to be the best format to help new or young companies that don't have a big tax liability in the first place. So it can be a difficult or structure to offer. But there are a lot of these incentives all across the country.
Yeah, and you mentioned TEDCO. Virginia has a Virginia Innovation Partnership Corporation, which is their version of TEDCO. And one of the things I think that has worked in Maryland relatively well is the Biotechnology Investor Tax Credit Program, which is an incentive for investors to invest in high-risk early-stage companies where they can get a tax break or a tax incentive or some money back. And that's somewhat more of an unusual program that I don't see as many states having. Is that true, Ellen?
I think people have looked to Maryland and looked at that program as an example. And so I don't think it's structured the same way in other states, but this idea of encouraging investment in your young firms is something that more and more states have done. And yes, that's been around for a long time, and there have been several evaluations of it. I was just looking at a review of it today in the latest analysis from Maryland. It's considered to meet its objectives. It's steady, helps not giant numbers of companies every year, but it's a significant part of the ecosystem and the support system in Maryland for the whole biohealth, biotech tech field. Yeah, I think that's been a solid one.
I think really we have some good successes in both Virginia and Maryland, and we're lucky and fortunate to have two progressive states right now that are trying to support not only big companies, but emerging companies in all different technology sectors. But let's go back to the BioHealth Capital Region and potentially biohealth industry, which is what we're particularly interested in. And let's talk about what you'd see as some of the success stories that have emerged in Virginia and Maryland over the last couple of years. And while it's competitive between the states and the district, it's a win when anyone in Virginia, D.C., or Maryland wins for our region, because as close proximity as we have, people could live in Virginia and work in Maryland, or live in Maryland and work in Virginia or in D.C. A win for any of these areas is a win for our region when we really look at the job growth and the employment opportunities.
I couldn't agree more. I just think thinking regionally makes so much sense for an industry like this. Operationally, in some ways, it doesn't matter who's where and who does what. The benefits are for the region, specifically for any individual business making a site location decision. Those factors, of course, do matter. But yes, it's a regional win. It means that everyone has more resources to draw from. It means that there's more opportunity to draw talent in and to keep talent here. It all just builds on itself. And yes, I agree. It's what happens in one place is going to generate benefits for the others. There have been some big wins, and the industry's had a lot of big announcements overall in the past couple of years. In Virginia, the Merck, the Eli Lilly, and the AstraZeneca investment announcements have been interesting. The one thing that really stood out to me from those announcements was the focus on workforce development. And I think this has been true everywhere. I know Maryland has put a lot of effort into this as well. But the importance of workforce development, not just incentives, but this co-investment in a pharmaceutical training center that I think all three of those companies are going to leverage in Virginia. That's huge. I love that kind of incentive. So it's everyone contributing. So the public sector is contributing, higher ed is contributing, the private sector is contributing. Everyone is working together. We're all investing in Virginia, in BioHealth Capital Region for the betterment of the region. The companies, of course, will benefit. But the individuals getting this training are going to benefit. The communities where this is occurring are going to benefit. The research base benefits. It's really a great way of thinking about how you spend your public sector money to encourage and why you're encouraging it, right? All of these benefits that are going to accrue from this focus on this sector, but specifically on workforce development for this sector. And Maryland's been going strong, Samsung, and you were telling me it's AstraZeneca
with their CAR T and cell therapy new facility in Montgomery County.
Yeah, to be part of these things and to see with the potential upside of it all for one hopes generation, a generation, if not generations, it's very exciting. Maryland has, for decades, supported this industry and really has such a strong ecosystem, such a strong space of talent, such amazing institutions and resources and networks. In addition to the incentives, it has the R&D tax credit, it has the financing programs, it has BioHealth innovation, it has the investor tax credit, it has all of these things that combined. And I think this is another interesting thing about incentives. If you just have an incentive that sits off by itself, it's not going to be nearly as effective as one that's embedded in the system, like I think you see in Maryland and as you're seeing in Virginia.
We're speaking with Ellen Harpel, the founder of Smart Incentives and expert in economic development incentives, regionally as well as nationally. And we mentioned that Maryland success. The thing that's unusual is Samsung Biologic, which is a recent announcement, is acquiring the old GSK facility in Rockville, which was the home for human genome sciences over 20 years ago, which was with MedImmune, two of the emerging biotechnology companies in America, which actually helped make Maryland and Montgomery County stand out nationally. And Human Genome Sciences was acquired by GSK, MedImmune acquired by AstraZeneca. And really, it's nice to see those organizations live through different generations of companies. And nice that we are able to replenish those facilities that have such a history within the BioHealth Capital Region. And thankful that some biologics saw the benefit of being within our region to take over that GSK and the Human Genome Sciences facility. So I guess we hope that we're going to see new players carry on the tradition for what we've been trying to build for over 20 years. I'll get off of my horse there a little bit, Ellen, and quit bragging about the BioHealth Capital Region. But let's talk a little bit about why is it so important to make this kind of information available about incentives to the public, decision makers, as well as to the companies that are seeking these types of incentives.
It's important for so many reasons. Well, let's start with the last one. The idea is that these programs exist for the companies to take advantage of, to use and participate. And that's why the policy decision has been made to make these incentive programs available. So you want the companies to be able to know about and to use them. But for policymakers and decision makers, it's important so that they understand all the benefits that have accrued as well as the costs. And there might be some information available to them on a regular basis about the cost of the incentive if they go look for it. But there isn't often, or there hasn't been until recently, a good look at the benefits, because the costs might occur in you see them in a spreadsheet or a report, like in a table. You say, this year it costs this much. Okay, but what did we get for that much? The benefits that we've been describing, Rich, are things that evolve over the years. So the story really can only come out over time, whether it was effective. You can say, and you should be able to say if you're offering incentives, this year, because on the performance requirements that we put in our contract, we paid this much, we got this much, whatever those terms are in your contract. But you also want to be able to tell the larger story and be able to have enough data to put it together to tell that larger story. So that's why the transparency on a regular basis is important. And it's why regular evaluations are important, because it's a chance to bring it all together and answer the real question, not just, okay, it costs this much and X jobs are created, but by spending that money and creating these jobs, here's how our community is better off. I think that's what policymakers want to know is happening with their economic development programs in general and their incentives specifically. So we really have to have the good quality data available to us to say that. So we're not just saying, oh, yes, anecdotally, my neighbor works there, or look, here's a building where there didn't used to be a building. There's better ways to tell that story that are meaningful to people. But it's also part of a very important feedback loop, because we don't want the incentives they don't need to be static forever. You can constantly improve them. So if you find one piece isn't working as planned, you figure out why, and then you can make adjustments. So that feedback loop that the good data from transparency and reporting provides, that gives policymakers the tools that they need to make better decisions. And then it's true with the professionals, the professional economic developers who are managing these programs on a daily basis. They probably more than anyone else want to know, be sure that they're doing the right thing in the right way. So they really value that data because it helps them either advocate for the program or advocate for changes to the program. So it's all very important information just to have good decision making, again, in the service of better outcomes.
With the changing dynamic and these incentives at the state and local level nationally, how does a company like Smart Incentives and you, Ellen, stay up to date on everything that's changing and emerging within the incentive industry on a daily basis?
Yeah, I wouldn't promise that anyone does that because it does change and it takes time for those changes to flow from, even if you follow all the legislation that deals with incentives every year, by the time it gets to rulemaking and then actual implementation, there's a lot of information out there. But there are a lot of good resources out there now that there didn't used to be. My good colleagues at the C2ER have an incentives database. That's always a good resource for at least what the programs are. Some of it's publicly available, and some of it's, I think you have to be a member of C2ER to access the incentives database. The National Conference of State Legislatures has a database of incentive evaluations. So this is new because before there might have been some evaluations, but you had to know to look for them in one specific state by some research agency within the state government that you might not have ever have heard of before. But NCSL is collecting these evaluations and making them available through a database. So you can see if you are interested in, again, say R&D tax credits or angel investor tax credits, you can see what evaluations in different states have said about their effectiveness and what made them effective or not. So there's a lot to be learned about that. Those are two resources that are available.
Great. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your company then. Tell me about the typical type of client or assignment that Smart Incentives gets engaged with in trying to help people evaluate incentives.
I primarily work with state or local economic development organizations who have a question about some aspect of their incentive policy or some concern about how well it's performing relative to their current objectives. Again, it's some international work, but primarily state and local economic development organizations. I also partner with a lot of other organizations who might work with other parts of state government. For example, I do a lot of work with a company out of Philadelphia called PFM. They know a lot more about government finance than I do. And so we do a lot of incentive evaluation work looking at return on investment and the financial impact of incentives. And I bring the economic development perspective, and they have more the government finance perspective. And so together we're a pretty powerful group, I think, answering the questions that people have about incentives. So those are some ways that I work and who I work with. And I'd say the projects fall into a couple of different categories. Straight up program evaluations are an important category, but advising on transparency and accountability practices is another. And as we started off with, really taking a good strategic look at the incentive portfolio, I find there's a lot of interest in this because a lot of the marquee incentives that states offer were created a decade or more ago. You asked about jobs, for example, and for a lot of communities then, job creation was absolutely the number one priority. It's still a priority, but when companies are struggling so much to attract workforce, the talent pool is changing and workforce talent pipelines are different than they used to be. The question is, does it make sense for my community to only evaluate business investment by the number of jobs that it was created? Are there other things that we care as much about? Can it only be 1,000 new jobs? But we don't have the people for 1,000 new jobs in our community. So what are new ways to think about their incentive portfolio and what they really want to accomplish with it?
The thing I'm understanding now better talking to you is that I have a board of directors, and on my board I have JLL and I have Alexandria Real Estate. And I would imagine you're evaluating the people who provide the incentives, while people like brokers and developers are the ones who are also evaluating incentives for their clients who are looking for the spaces. So you're on one side, they're on the other side, and they have to have sort of an equal knowledge of what the incentives are that are available for people that want to move into or expand in a certain geographic region. Is that true?
That is true. And that's a business decision that I made early on with Smart Incentives. I only work with the organizations that offer incentives. I don't work with anyone seeking incentives. So my clientele are the economic development organizations or state and local government leaders. That's right. But there are many consulting firms and real estate firms and site selection consulting firms that care a lot about how the incentives affect their specific company. They are also looking for that information and doing the pro formas and looking at the spreadsheets to see which incentives are applicable and useful for their clients.
And best for them. So basically, as we close this discussion, what can a biohealth innovation, an organization like we have, how can we be helpful with companies and helping them understand and get access to these opportunities? And how well do you think DC, Maryland, and Virginia are playing in this incentive game on a national basis?
I think organizations like BioHealth Innovation are incredibly important, especially for reaching smaller companies or newer or younger companies. One of the big challenges with incentives, especially those designed for smaller or new businesses, is making companies aware of them. So trusted organizations like yours that are already communicating with them play a very important role in raising awareness. If you are a startup, there's no reason that you would even know a TEDCO exists, or that on a state economic development website, there's a tax credit or a grant program that might apply to you. I don't think it's natural to go look to these places, but that's where the information lives. But you know both. You communicate with both. And so I think that awareness role is very important, but also being trusted, because I think entrepreneurs are bombarded with information and resources that might be helpful to them. And having somebody say, yeah, this one's good. No, this one is probably not worth your time, not because it's a bad program, but because it's not a good fit for you. Somebody that can help them sort through the pros and cons and figure out the best fit is a real valuable resource.
How do you think we're doing in the BioHealth Capital Region? How are Maryland, DC, and Virginia competing with all of the other people around the United States?
I think they're doing pretty well. The projects that we've mentioned alone are fantastic. Having just volume of activity across the region that we have, fantastic. The talent pool in the region has always been very strong, and the more announcements and investments like this, the stronger it will be. But it's a global field, and so the competition is always stiff. I think on the incentive front, it's always worth keeping an eye on what other places are doing. And again, at one point it was all about tax credits and job creation, and really now the conversation is about workforce. And so always being prepared. And I think all three jurisdictions do this. I think they stay on top of things. They know the trends. They're active in the industry. They're not just staying by themselves. So they know what's needed. So they're ready to respond and react. I really think continues to be all sorts of upside. And I think that they all perform well.
Well, this has been a very educational discussion with you, Ellen. And is there anything that you would like to let the listeners know that we didn't discuss that we really didn't cover?
We covered a lot. I guess I just would like to wrap up by saying Smart Incentives is about providing information and making resources available and accessible. So for any listeners that are interested in this topic, I encourage you to visit the website. We're redoing it now to make our information a little bit more user-friendly and accessible and findable. Sign up for our blog updates. We write about incentive activity quite a bit. Connect with me on LinkedIn or contact me directly, obviously. And I speak to a lot of audiences, and not just people who are immersed in incentive policy work, but groups including boards and elected officials. And so if anybody thinks that these are messages or themes that would be valuable in your community for your leaders to hear, please reach out. I love doing speaking engagements, and I love talking about incentives.
Well, that's obvious. You love speaking about it because you've just done that for the last 40 minutes, Ellen. So very good job. So if people want to contact you other than the website, do you have an email address you'd like to give them?
Yeah, reach out to me at ellen@smartincentives.org.
Very good. Thank you. We've been talking with Ellen Harpel, founder of Smart Incentives, been in business about 27 years now with Smart Incentives. So thank you for being on BioTalk today. Let's stay in touch with changes in incentives and the continuing wins that we hope to have in the BioHealth Capital Region, Ellen.
Thank you, Rich. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.